Thank you, Speaker, and it's my pleasure to rise today to speak to the PC Opposition Day motion regarding a moratorium on school closures, rural school closures, and a review of the Accommodation Review Guidelines, or as it's referred to now, PARGs. And I will specifically address this motion and some concerns that I have with it. I'm supportive of the idea, absolutely. In fact, November 21st of last year, I held a press conference and had people from across the province and rural communities join me, not only for the press conference to talk about the issue regarding rural school closures and what that means for those communities, but we also had a rally out on the front lawn of Queen's Park. And so I want to recognize those that came to Queen's Park back in November, and that's not the first time I've raised the issue. Certainly not the first time our party has raised the issue. That really was the first time that the PCs decided they wanted to get on board, because they realized by the number of people coming to Queen's Park that maybe it was a good issue for them to jump on, probably for votes. But I'm glad that they finally joined the party. Or that's a bad choice of words. I'm not sure we'd want them in our party. But anyways, I'd like to thank Susan McKenzie of the Alliance Against School Closures and Judy Keeling, who joined me on the panel for our press conference, and the many people from across the province that came for the rally. And I'd also like to thank Krista Wiley from Fix Our Schools, who has been a tireless advocate for proper funding of our education system, specifically around the condition of the buildings and the fact that there is a $15 billion repair backlog, capital repair backlog. Wow. And I know the government announced some money. It's not even going to address the repair backlog, let alone the condition of the schools going forward. So I think that that might have been an important piece to acknowledge in the motion as well. Part of the reason that school boards are faced with closing schools is based purely on the condition of those buildings, because this government does not give school boards enough money to manage the upkeep of these buildings. So while the minister stood up in her time and talked about these wonderful new school buildings that they're putting up, these modern facilities, and how excited these children are to be in them, the fact of the matter is a lot of those kids and families are excited to have new school buildings because the schools they were in are crumbling. They don't have the technology that they need. They don't have warm classrooms in the winter. They don't have cool classrooms in the summer. They don't have ceilings that are not leaking when it rains. The buildings are in such terrible condition, and I'm not making this up. I was a school board trustee for 8 years. I can tell you the way this government underfunds the system is deplorable. And so they want to talk about how they support students, and they want to talk about how they well, I got a member from the other side saying I'm making it up. Perhaps you should actually talk to school board trustees. We've actually had several school boards come forward and say how much they are underfunded, not only for programming and services for students, but for the care and the upkeep of their buildings. So, anyway, Speaker, I'm not going to engage in that conversation with someone who clearly has not been speaking to Ontarians or to school board trustees. The minister also talked about how trustees, so she wants to put it solely in the lap of trustees, the fact that these schools are closing, which is unfair and unreasonable. As a former trustee for 8 years, I can tell you that trustees are elected by the municipality, the people in their municipalities, to make decisions based on what is best for their communities. They are not elected by the people in their communities to do the dirty work of the Liberal government, which is exactly what is happening based on the current funding formula. That is exactly what is happening. This government is tying the hands of those elected officials that they claim to respect, those elected officials that they say they empower to make these decisions. In fact, they are tying their hands. And, you know, Speaker, they talk about the process around school closures and how, again, it's up to trustees to make these decisions, to go through the process. It's up to the trustees to consider the input of the communities, to listen to the businesses, to the people that live in those communities before making the decision to close schools. Again, it's a flawed process. If there was proper funding in place, then the majority of the time, not all the time, because again, sometimes there are buildings that are in such disrepair because of lack of funding that trustees have to make the difficult decision to close those schools. The majority of the time, the decision is based solely on the fact that the government is starving them of funding to keep those schools open. And if the trustees actually had proper funding, they would choose to keep those small community schools open. And in this case, they would make the decision to keep those rural schools open because trustees realize that closing rural schools and ripping the heart out of a community and putting kids on buses for hours a day, some 2-3 hours a day,
terrible, is
not what's best for students.
Shameful.
Yep.
How can you expect a child to be on a bus for that long and then go into a school and be able to learn? It's unreasonable and it's unfair. Speaker, the minister talked about how much they're supporting rural schools, when in fact they cut $10 million from the geographic circumstance grant over 2 years. That was a fund specifically to support rural schools. I noticed the minister didn't talk about the $10 million cut that they've made specifically to rural schools. It's interesting because before the Premier became the Premier, she actually fought school closures. I'm not sure how that's changed. The Premier mentioned this morning that when they came into power 13 years ago, they supported moratoriums. Why do they not support them now? Why have they actually, in 2015, changed the school closure process in order to shorten it, to actually, in some cases, completely cut out community input, cut out the voices of those municipal leaders, those partners who may come and actually want to help and be part of a community hub, and more importantly, cut out the voices of the parents and the students that would access their education in these buildings. And it's interesting because the minister actually made a statement that basically said that larger classes and fewer education workers, fewer teachers, is actually working better for students, which is absurd to me. I don't know how she could make an argument like that other than trying to cover for the fact that they're underfunding the system and school boards are actually being forced to eliminate education workers and to increase class sizes, something that I know education workers constantly advocate for smaller class sizes. Now, specifically to the motion before us, again, I have issues with it. I'm supportive in principle, but it doesn't actually address funding. So you can't call for a moratorium and say stop school closures without saying give these school boards the resources that they need to actually keep these schools open. So I think that was quite a large oversight on the part of the PC party and their leader Patrick Brown. It also doesn't talk about an end date. When would the moratorium end? Because we do need to empower trustees. We actually need to give them the tools that they need to do what it is they're elected to do. We need for them to be able to make a decision. So we need to know when, if we're going to impose a moratorium on school closures, and I hope somebody from the PC party, when they have their remarks, will be able to clarify that. When exactly will that moratorium end? What kind of flexibility will trustees be given in order to decide when it actually is best to consolidate schools? I'd like to say consolidate, but frankly, when you consolidate, you're closing schools. You're taking at least 2 schools and putting them into one. It's interesting to me that the Conservative Party would bring forward an education motion without speaking specifically about, they want to talk about supporting rural communities, and that certainly is important. And me, having been a trustee for city schools, have had conversations with my colleagues that represent rural schools, and we recognize the importance of rural communities, the schools in their communities. It's a very different situation than in an urban community. But you cannot talk about supporting children and supporting schools without talking about supporting the education workers. And what we've seen from both sides of the House, both the Liberals and the PCs, is that they don't support education workers, whether it was through 103 or 115, stripping teachers of their right to strike and imposing contracts on them. We have seen that they don't truly support the education workers in our system. And I would suggest that that's a very important piece. And the Premier's looking at me saying, come on, but your voting record is your voting record. The bills you bring forward are the bills you bring forward. It's a very important piece to recognize and acknowledge our education workers and support them as well. Thank you, Speaker.
Thank you very much. Further debate. I recognize the Minister.